disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein tried to squeeze money out of the tech giant Bill Gates by threatening to expose an alleged affair.
He was getting dirt on very, very powerful people. Oligarchs, billionaires, presidents, prime ministers, politicians.
Why did so many rich and powerful people hang out with a man who pled guilty to sex crimes?
Now, for anyone following the Jeffrey Epstein story, this is the news they've been waiting for. Evidence that the billionaire sex offender was blackmailing some of his rich and powerful associates. In this case, it appears that Epstein was trying to extort Bill Gates with a veiled threat to expose his affair with a young Russian woman.
2 years ago, I said to everyone that I'm going to meet this guy. Nobody believed me. Last year, I played against him at the same table at the National Bridge Tournament in Washington, D.C. I didn't beat him, but I tried to kick him with my leg.
Mila Antonova was in her mid-20s when she met Bill Gates, who was in his mid-50s. The year was around 2010. The two shared a passion for the card game bridge, and Antonova interviewed him about it.
Who are you?
Bill Gates.
Why do you play bridge?
It's both fun and then you learn how to think, you learn strategy. There's great people who play bridge. It's always learning new things no matter how good you get.
According to the Wall Street Journal, the two began an affair while Bill was still married to Melinda. Jeffrey Epstein found out about it and then allegedly tried to extort money from Gates in 2017.
At some point you have to draw a line. At some point you are Bill Gates and you have one of the biggest fortunes in the world. Maybe you don't need to meet with the guy who's like a child sex predator. Maybe that's the thing you don't need to do.
But the strange part of this story is not so much the affair, but how Epstein was even able to move in these circles as a convicted sex offender. He was convicted in 2008 of soliciting sex with a minor, but after his release from jail in Florida in 2009, he carried on life as normal. In 2010, he threw a big coming home party in his mansion in Manhattan, attended by celebrities including George Stephanopoulos, Katie Couric and Chelsea Handler, and perhaps most surprisingly, Prince Andrew.
Now, I went there with the sole purpose of saying to him that because he had been convicted, it was inappropriate for us to be seen together.
Epstein also met with Bill Gates numerous times. According to the Journal, starting in 2011, Gates had more than half a dozen meetings scheduled with Epstein, including dinners at Epstein's New York townhouse, documents show.
When you met him 10 years ago, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from minors.
Those meetings were a mistake. They didn't result in what he purported, and I cut them off. That goes back a long time ago now.
This picture was apparently taken in 2011 at Epstein's Manhattan mansion. James Staley was a senior JP Morgan executive. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers stood to one side of Epstein, Bill Gates the other. They're all standing around, smiling, with a convicted sex offender. On the far right of the picture is the hitherto little covered Boris Nikolic, Gates' scientific advisor. It was Nikolic who introduced Mila Antonova to Jeffrey Epstein in 2013. Antonova asked her new friend Epstein if he would fund her online bridge tuition business. Epstein declined to invest, but did pay for her to attend a coding school.
So Jeffrey Epstein pays her money in order to get secrets, in order to go and blackmail the rich people.
Meanwhile, Epstein was trying to get Bill Gates to donate $100 million to a multi-billion-dollar charitable fund he wanted to set up with JP Morgan Chase. This time it was Epstein's turn to be disappointed, as Gates declined to contribute. In retaliation, in 2017, Epstein apparently tried to blackmail him, sending him an email demanding to be reimbursed for Antonova's coding school. The Journal goes on to say the implication behind the message, according to people who have viewed it, was that Epstein could reveal the affair if Gates did not keep up an association between the two men. A spokeswoman for Mr. Gates said Mr. Gates met with Epstein solely for philanthropic purposes. Having failed repeatedly to draw Mr. Gates beyond these matters, Epstein tried unsuccessfully to leverage a past relationship to threaten Mr. Gates.
Do you regret the relationship that you maintained with him against Melinda's advice and wishes?
Oh, I've said that you're going way back in time, but yeah,
new audience.
I will say for the, over 100th time, yeah, I shouldn't have had dinners with him.
Epstein had a way of sexually compromising people. Is that what Melinda was warning you about?
No. I mean, no, I had dinner with him, and that's all.
Jeffrey Epstein was released from a Florida jail in 2009, and 10 years later he was found dead in another prison in New York. In the intervening decade, his life was a swirl of social engagements and of manipulating or trying to manipulate the world's richest and most powerful people. And in one of the final strange acts of his life, just 3 days before he died, he made Gates's confidant, Boris Nikolic, the backup executor of his estate. Nikolic told the Journal that Epstein didn't discuss the idea with him beforehand and that he subsequently declined to serve. He couldn't have listed Bill because that would have been too obvious, so he chose me, he said. I have come to believe it was likely a retaliatory move against Bill Gates.
This is just the surface. Yeah. And it is confirmation of what all of us suspected, that he would get, you know, elites into compromised positions by inviting them to his island, flying them on the plane, and making them feel like everything was cool, and then using that information to blackmail them.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now, and we're joined by Conchita Sarnoff, a senior fellow at Georgetown University and author of Trafficking, Eric Fidali, a senior attorney representing some of Epstein's alleged victims, and finally we have Vic Hartman, a forensic accountant and former FBI special agent. Conchita Sarnoff, this is a very big couple of weeks for this story. The Deutsche Bank settlement we're going to get to in a moment, but first let's start with the Bill Gates story. And for a very long time, he's been saying that his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein has extended to no more than dinners with him. How does this scoop in the Wall Street Journal change our understanding of their relationship?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. As you know, the establishment leaders such as Mr. Gates had relationships with Mr. Epstein because of several reasons. One of them, of course, had to do with money, which is the key to this case. Favors for money. There was always an exchange, not only between Mr. Epstein and the victims, but there was an exchange between Mr. Epstein and all of the establishment leaders that he forged relationships with. Mr. Gates was included in those friendships.
Well, Epstein may have wanted Bill Gates to donate $100 million to his fund, but he never did that. And he goes further to say that he never had any relationship with, for example, Epstein and his fund, the Bill and Melinda Gates Fund, or anything else. It never extended beyond these dinners. But what the Wall Street Journal is saying is actually Epstein had something over Bill Gates.
Well, Epstein tended to do that. As you might remember, he had cameras, secret cameras stashed all over his house. Not only his Palm Beach estate, but the Manhattan, the USVI, and the New Mexico ranch. And he had those cameras installed in those particular places for a very specific reason. He threatened the victims with his friendships with establishment leaders, and he blackmailed establishment leaders for reasons that, as we all know, have now come forward, or at least many of those reasons have come forward. And so Mr. Gates, and this goes back to Mrs. Gates, Melinda Gates's divorce filings, when she warned her husband her then husband, that, you know, she did not like what she was privy to. She warned Mr. Gates not to continue his friendship with Mr. Epstein, and clearly he ignored her wishes and continued. And there was obviously a reason for that. And it certainly wasn't money, because Mr. Gates did not need Jeffrey Epstein for advice, for tax advice, or for any other reason, particularly for funds.
Well, you say
he
that.
He did not need Mr. Epstein.
Yeah, you say that, but Gates's argument is that, you know, Epstein was very well connected and he had hoped that Epstein would help him raise money for global health, for a good cause. Vic Hartman, as a former FBI agent, you know, you've read the Wall Street Journal scoop. Do you agree, from what you've seen, that Epstein was trying to extort Bill Gates?
You know, my sense is that it wasn't so much extortion as it was needling, and that's because the Epstein-Bill Gates relationship had already preceded this. Some substantial amount of time had passed. Then Epstein learns of this relationship with the Russian chess player, and then they may have had a romantic relationship. And then he sends them an email and kind of needles them, saying, "Hey, I know about your affair," and just kind of letting them know. But I think the relationship had too much time had passed. So I don't know if I go so far as to say extortion.
That's interesting. I mean, Gates' own spokespeople say there was a threat there. They use the word threatened, and with a past relationship. But, you know, we'll leave that hanging. Eric Fidali, you know, you're a lawyer in New York, and when Epstein was convicted in 2008 in Florida, did it make a big splash in New York? Did, you know, the high society, did they all know about this conviction? Or is there any plausible deniability there where they say, well, we didn't know the full extent of Epstein's convictions and the civil cases against him?
It would be really difficult to say that you had no idea what Epstein was up to or what he had been accused of or what he had even been arrested of. So I would say that that's a stretch to assume that you had no concept of what Epstein was up to or what type of business he was in or the type of scheme he was running.
And yet it was more important to use him to get money and other opportunities than to keep a safe distance from him. That's extraordinary. Let me tell you something that Gates has said in his defense. I didn't realize that meeting with him almost downplayed the incredibly awful things he did. Conchita, I know that you have said in the past that just by association, he has lent his authority and his credibility to Jeffrey Epstein, which Epstein used, in turn, as leverage on his victims. Can you explain that?
Yes, in fact, Epstein made it a point, and if you look at his, what the media labeled little black book, if you look at that directory, which is just simply a pile of computer sheets with many, many names, many of those people who I have actually contacted, those whom I know, did not even know Epstein. They knew of him, but they didn't know. The key establishment leaders on Wall Street didn't know Epstein. They had no idea who he was. A few people did, but not many. So it goes to show that Epstein likes big names. I mean, the reason Jeffrey Epstein and I met and we knew each other for 20 years is because of my ex-husband's family name. Sarnoff, David Sarnoff, founded NBC. And so a mutual friend introduced us, and he thought that I would open up a world to him the way Ghislaine Maxwell opened up a social world to him, that world in the UK. So Epstein was someone who just wanted to be surrounded by people with big names, and he wanted to be surrounded and be able to utilize what he needed most at the time we're talking 1992 when we met. So he needed social entrees. His money came directly from Leslie Wexner. That's who gave him the first $1 billion to start the Jeffrey Epstein Fund in New York. And then what he needed was social entrees into New York. And he was very ambitious. Unlike his brother Mark, Jeffrey wanted to be at the very top of the social game in New York. And so he would meet people who had names, and he had his directory full of names. And yet, for me, the most surprising thing is that Mr. Gates befriended Epstein in 2013. Mr. Epstein had already been indicted. He had been arrested. There were pending civil cases against Mr. Epstein at the time. He was a level 3 registered sex offender in Manhattan. There had been multiple cases filed in Manhattan, in New York, in Los Angeles, and in New Mexico. Why would someone with Mr. Gates's professional background and expertise and resources want to befriend someone who was in the middle of litigation, continued litigation? That, to me, made no sense.
That's right. I mean, in 2010 and onwards, he not only a convicted sex offender, but also had many, many civil cases against him as well. Let's pose that question. Let's pose that question to Vic Hartman. So Epstein wanted Gates for a $100 million donation to this multi-billion-dollar fund he wanted to set up with JP Morgan Chase. Now, what would be in it for Epstein to run this philanthropic fund? I don't think it was philanthropy.
No. Epstein obviously had a poor reputation around the world. Everybody knew it, and he knew he had a poor background. And so what he was trying to do is resurrect this. He wanted to make himself look better for the public. So if he's associated with Bill Gates, if he could get this philanthropic foundation, this charitable foundation up and running, then that would help restore his bad reputation.
Any money in it for him?
I think there would be some fees maybe associated with it. I think the money wasn't so much. He was already a wealthy individual. It wasn't the money. It was trying to restore his reputation, being associated with a charitable foundation. And if he had Bill Gates in it, that would just, rocket it up to a great reputation, to a great notoriety for him.
And it wouldn't have just been the $100 million. It would have been his name, Gates's name. That would have been a hook to bring in others?
Yes. Bring in others. The foundation would then have worldwide recognition, and now maybe his reputation, his bad reputation, might diminish in some way. I think that was his objective.
Yeah. Of course, Gates didn't give the money, a wise decision. Do you think that having control of that fund, multi-billion-dollar fund, which is what he was hoping for, along with JP Morgan Chase, would have given him power as well? Epstein.
We're giving him power, maybe another source of money.
Yeah.
But I think it's just the reputation, and putting Bill Gates in there, and then he would get others into it. It was going to be with JP Morgan. So it would really just try to restore his reputation.
Okay. Let's turn to the Deutsche Bank settlement that happened last week, Eric Fidali. So Deutsche Bank agrees to pay $75 million to settle a lawsuit that claimed the bank had enabled Jeffrey Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring. Eric, can you just explain that lawsuit a little bit more for our viewers who are just new to it?
Yes. So what that lawsuit alleged is that Deutsche Bank facilitated Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme. Everyone knows, it's no secret, that Jeffrey Epstein had one of the largest sex trafficking schemes we've ever seen. He was a sex trafficker almost by trade. That's what he did. However, he couldn't do it alone. So what it alleges is Deutsche Bank basically knowingly funded and facilitated this sex trafficking scheme, and therefore they are alleged to be liable for facilitating, for knowingly participating and benefiting in the sex trafficking scheme. That's what the lawsuit alleged, and of course they have now settled this case for reported $75 million, which says to me, as an attorney who settles a lot of cases, and a lot of cases of this nature, that Deutsche Bank did not want this going any further. They did not want any more discovery on this. They did not want any more depositions. They certainly did not want this going to a public trial.
But importantly, it's not tantamount to an admission of guilt.
Absolutely not. And that is very common. Often in settlement agreements like this, you will even see the defendant will insert into the settlement agreement, this is not an admission of liability. This is not an admission of guilt. This is you use phrases like, this is a settlement for convenience, that type of thing. So that's absolutely not an indication of guilt in any way, but you can read between the lines and say, well, why would Deutsche Bank settle? What's the purpose of settling for such a large $75 million amount?
It does make a lot of people wonder, at home, how is it that a bank, if it's a bank, they can pay $75 million, and if it's a person, they end up in jail? Can you explain the difference?
Well, yeah, certainly. This was a civil lawsuit, right? So this was filing a civil lawsuit in the United States court system, which is what you do for money damages. Now, if there are criminal liability there, and perhaps someone at Deutsche Bank broke the law, or the bank itself broke the law, there could be parallel criminal charges. But this was just the civil lawsuit against the bank, which is why the only remedy was money damages.
Vic Hartman, as a forensic accountant, you've been taking a look at this story. Do you see any red flags in Jeffrey Epstein's activities with Deutsche Bank that should have been picked up?
Oh, absolutely. And also keep in mind, in 2020, the New York regulators, banking regulators, take a look at Deutsche Bank, and they found, in fact, there was a $150 million settlement. So there you have a regulator reviewing all the facts. They had discovery. They looked at the emails. They interviewed lots of people, and they settled with Deutsche Bank for $150 million. So so it's really the same factual predicate that's now the $75 million settlement, and it's a class action and it hasn't been approved by the judge, but it probably will be. But underlying this is you have Epstein, the sex trafficker, and he is the benefactor of all this with all these young girls. And it was really like a sex pyramid scheme, and that he would recruit a girl, pay her, and then that girl would go out and recruit more, and they would recruit more, and they would recruit more. He was his addiction to young women was several women a day, every day of the week for years and years. What fed all this was cash. You can't do this without cash. He's not paying wire transfers. He's not writing checks. He needs cash. And the regulators in New York found that over a 4-year period, he withdrew, actually through his attorney, $800,000 in cash. That's on average $200,000 a year. Now, when you pull large amounts of cash from a bank, there's this regulatory framework, and the banks have to file CTRs, cash transaction reports, or suspicious activity reports. In the case of Deutsche Bank, they were not filing these SARs, these suspicious activity reports. So his attorneys were withdrawing like $7,500 2 or 3 times a month, then giving the cash to Epstein. It's almost certainly that this is the money that was feeding this sex pyramid. If these SARs would have been filed, maybe law enforcement could have picked up on this. There was red flags where they should have filed it and did not.
Right.
But if they would have filed it, maybe law enforcement could have got to this quicker.
Eric,
so that's the big problem.
Eric, why is it when we read about Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operation, most of the media still frame it as the alleged sex trafficking operation?
That's a good question. First, Jeffrey Epstein, who it is not alleged. Jeffrey Epstein absolutely facilitated and participated in and ran a sex trafficking scheme. I think that was well put, actually, a sex trafficking pyramid scheme, because that's what it was. That was what he did. And it was the most prolific sex trafficking scheme we've ever seen. Now, certainly when you are including others in it, that's when it becomes alleged. When you're accusing Deutsche Bank or any other bank or any other high-profile name, that's when it becomes alleged, because other than with Ghislaine Maxwell, it has not been proven in court, right? Ghislaine Maxwell, we can say it's not alleged. She absolutely participated in Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme. She's been convicted of that crime. But for Jeffrey Epstein, it is not alleged. He was a sex trafficker. He was a predator. He was a monster. And he was the most prolific monster and sexual predator, perhaps, of our time.
Conchita, when you see that no individuals are being prosecuted for allegedly aiding Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking scheme, are you angry about that? Are you campaigning to have any changes made to the law?
Yes. You know, my goal with this case, the reason I have stuck to it for 15 years is twofold. Number one, when I wrote Trafficking in 2000, when I published Trafficking in 2016, the reason was to enforce, to have the district attorneys and the USAO across the United States enforce the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, which has recently been reauthorized. That, to me, was the ultimate goal when I began to investigate the Epstein case, because without enforcement of our laws, we cannot protect our children. Without prosecution of predators, we cannot protect our children. That's number one. As I continued the investigation, my goal became secondary, which was, why is it that banks such as JP Morgan and Deutsche, and I know others, but let's not concerning the Epstein case, many banks continue to protect high net worth, high risk clients? Why is that? Well, we all know the reason. I don't need to explain it. But bottom line is, Congress needs to enact legislation, DOJ needs to enforce that legislation that makes board members, not just bank CEOs, but board members liable for protecting high net worth, high risk clients. The Epstein case is a perfect example.
Vic, one of the spokespeople for Deutsche Bank has declined to comment about the settlement, but he has said it made considerable progress in remedying a number of past issues. And we do know that Deutsche Bank has invested $4 billion to improve its controls. Do you think these are substantive and real changes at the bank?
Well, first of all, that is a significant investment, and I do think they have a genuine interest in trying to change things. However, after every one of these settlements, the banks always go back and say, well, we've made changes. This isn't going to happen again. And yet it happens again and again. So I am for all robust and civil enforcement, criminal enforcement, and compliance issues. But time will tell. We'll see if Deutsche Bank is again in trouble in the news here in the next year or two, or sometime down the road. So I'm skeptical.
Vic Hartman, Arik Fudali, and Conchita Sarnoff, thank you all so much. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.